On May 14, 1973, a chilling nightmare unfolded at the Alday family farm in Seminole County, Georgia. 4 dangerous criminals had just escaped from a Maryland prison and were on the run. Hungry, desperate, and ruthless, they found the Alday trailer and broke in, thinking it was empty. But their plan took a dark turn. Ned Alday and his son Jerry returned home unexpectedly, walking straight into the ambush. Held at gunpoint, they were forced into the trailer and executed without mercy. One by one, more family members unknowingly stepped into the trap. Jimmy Alday, arriving next, was shot. Then came Aubrey Alday, Ned's brother, and Sugi Alday, another son. Each met the same chilling end. The most horrifying moment came when Mary Alday, Jerry's wife, was captured, dragged miles away, and subjected to unimaginable horrors before being murdered. Her body was found days later, left on a mound of fire ants. In a matter of hours, 6 lives were taken in a massacre so horrifying and so deadly that it still holds the grim title of the most gruesome mass murder in Georgia's history. These brutal killings left a deep scar, and the debate about whether true justice was served continues to this day. To really understand how everything unfolded, let's first take a look at the criminals involved, starting with Carl Isaacs, the mastermind behind it all. At just 19 years old, Carl wasn't exactly a newcomer to crime. In fact, by the time this massacre took place, he had already built a reputation as a habitual thief. He wasn't just a petty criminal either. Carl had a way with words and could charm his way into getting what he wanted, often manipulating people to get ahead. His criminal journey began early, with stealing cars and breaking into homes as a teenager. By 16, he was already deep into his criminal ways, landing himself in trouble with the law multiple times. But nothing really stuck until March 27, 1973, when he was finally sentenced and sent to Maryland State Penitentiary. However, soon after he arrived, chaos erupted. A riot broke out in the prison, and Carl was caught in the middle of it. For over 8 hours, he was brutally attacked by other inmates, leaving him badly beaten. This led to his transfer to a new facility for his protection. He was moved to the Maryland Correctional Camp temporarily before being transferred again on April 25, 1973, to the minimum security Poplar Hill. This move, however, would prove to be a huge mistake for the authorities. As it turned out, Carl already had an inside connection, his 26-year-old half-brother, Wayne Coleman. Like Carl, Wayne spent much of his childhood bouncing in and out of foster care. His criminal history was also lengthy, involving car theft and breaking into homes. Wayne had already been at Poplar Hill for a few months before Carl's arrival. Now, the two brothers couldn't have been more different. Carl was bold, aggressive, and manipulative, while Wayne was shy, reserved, and more of a follower. It didn't take Carl long to find Wayne at the facility, and once he did, he wasted no time revealing his escape plan. He told Wayne he wanted him to be part of it. Wayne agreed, but on one condition. Carl had to bring along his friend, George Dungy, a 36-year-old inmate locked up for failing to pay child support, which was considered a minor crime compared to his fellow prisoners. Wayne and George had become close during their time in prison, even developing a romantic relationship. So when Wayne approached George about the escape plan, George, even though he was soon to be released, agreed to join the escape. However, Carl wasn't exactly thrilled about George being part of the plan. In fact, Carl wasn't fond of George at all, largely because of his race. But despite the tension, the trio was formed, and they managed to break out on May 5, 1973. Around 3 in the morning, Carl and his crew managed to sneak through a bathroom window and made a break for it, disappearing into the surrounding woods. They used the trees and underbrush to cover their escape, eventually finding their way to Baltimore, Maryland. There, they managed to swipe a car to continue their getaway. By the time they secured a ride, the authorities at Poplar Hill had realized the prisoners were missing. But here's the crazy part. The prison didn't bother to alert the local authorities because they didn't think these guys were dangerous. They didn't exactly rush to bring them back. The escapees laid low in Baltimore for the next 2 days, just trying to blend in. But Carl, ever the mastermind, decided he wanted to bring along his younger brother, Billy Isaacs, who was just 16. Billy, like most younger siblings, looked up to Carl and was all in when his brother offered him a seat in the car. So now it was the 4 of them, Carl, Wayne, George, and Billy, hitting the road. They spent about a week hanging around Maryland, but eventually the reality hit. They needed money to keep going. So they did what they knew best. They started breaking into houses along their way to fund their next move. Now Carl's ultimate goal was to head south, specifically to Florida or Mexico, where he and his crew could live free from the law. But before they could get there, they needed to keep moving. On May 10th, 1973, while traveling near McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, Carl spotted a truck with no owner around. He thought this was the perfect chance to steal a vehicle. As Carl and his crew tried to take it, a young man named Richard Miller, the truck's neighbor, saw them and decided to intervene. Instead of letting them get away, Richard chased after them. Unfortunately, he was caught, and the group argued about who would take the life of the young man. In the end, they tied him up, forced him to his knees, and shot him in the back of the head. They dumped his body on a remote logging road, hoping he would be forgotten. Afterward, Carl's gang continued south, eventually landing in Donaldsonville, Georgia on May 14, 1973. The town seemed peaceful and isolated, perfect for hiding out. By about 4 p.m., they spotted a trailer and broke in, tearing it apart for anything valuable. While Billy and George kept lookout, Carl and Wayne started to search. But just as they were getting into it, a blue Jeep appeared on the road. Inside the Jeep were Ned Alday and his son Jerry, and that's when everything took a deadly turn. But before diving into the events of that day, it's important to understand the Alday family and the legacy they left behind. The patriarch, Ned Alday, was born on September 7, 1910, in Donaldsonville, Georgia. He met the love of his life, Ernestine, in their small community, and the two eloped in 1935. Together, they built a strong, loving family, raising 9 children and establishing a solid reputation in their community. The Aldays were the epitome of Southern hospitality, always helping out their neighbors and embodying wholesome values. Ned wasn't just a family man, he was a pillar in the local community. He played a key role in building the local church, and many members of the Alday family, including his children, contributed significantly to the church as officers and Sunday school teachers. Financially, the Aldays were responsible and hardworking. Early on in their relationship, Ned and Ernestine saved every penny to buy a small home, which they later traded for nearly 400 acres of farmland, complete with a larger farmhouse on River Road. The farm was a family operation, with everyone pitching in to help. By 1973, however, only 2 of their older sons remained close enough to continue working on the farm. Jerry Alday, at 34 years old, had moved into his own trailer a few miles down the road with his wife, Mary. His older brother Chester, known as Sugi, lived even closer with his wife, Barbara, just yards away from the Alday farmhouse. By all accounts, the Aldays were the kind of people who kept to themselves. They were quiet, hard-working folks with no criminal history, just a peaceful, down-to-earth family. But on May 14, 1973, nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As mentioned earlier, it was just another normal day when Ned Alday and his son Jerry were heading back to Jerry's trailer after a long day's work. They had their usual plan to meet up, talk about the day, and figure out what was next. But as they got closer to the trailer, they were suddenly confronted at gunpoint by Carl Isaacs. Carl ordered them inside the trailer, and once they were in, he made them empty their pockets onto the kitchen table. But all he found were a few coins and other insignificant items, nothing of real value. So he decided to separate the two. Jerry, who was 35, was taken to one side of the house, and Ned at 66 was led to the other side. It wasn't long before the horror started. Carl shot Jerry 4 times with a .22 caliber gun. Meanwhile, Wayne, who was with Carl, was handling Ned in the other room. Wayne shot Ned once in the head with a .32 caliber gun, but it wasn't enough to kill him. Ned, though gravely injured, managed to get up and fight back. Carl heard the commotion and rushed in to help Wayne, shooting Ned 5 more times with his .22. And Carl didn't stop there. He actually stayed at the trailer for a while, waiting for Mary, Jerry's wife, to come home. Before he killed Jerry, he had asked if Jerry was married. Jerry told him he was, and begged Carl not to hurt his wife, but that only seemed to fuel Carl's desire to take more lives. He wanted to wait for Mary himself. But before he could do that, Jimmy Alday, a 25-year-old, showed up. He'd just finished parking the tractor and walked up to the back door. When he knocked, expecting to see his brother, he was met by Wayne with a gun in his face. Wayne went through Jimmy's pockets, just like with Jerry and Ned, but found nothing of value. Carl was furious, accusing him of showing up because he heard the gunshots. Jimmy denied it, explaining that this was just part of their regular routine. But Carl wasn't buying it and ordered Jimmy to the living room, where he forced him to lie face down on the couch. Without hesitation, Carl shot Jimmy twice in the back of the head with his .22 caliber gun. Afterward, Carl went outside and decided it was time for him and his crew to leave. But as he was moving the tractor, he heard another car pull up. It was Mary Alday, Jerry's wife, returning home with groceries. Carl snuck up behind her and pressed a gun to her back, just like he had done to the men. Mary was forced into the trailer, and Carl rifled through her purse, finding only $1 and some small items. But just as Carl was dealing with Mary, 2 more Alday family members arrived: Chester, Ned's son, and Aubrey, Ned's brother. They were laughing and chatting when Carl, already on edge, stormed outside and captured them at gunpoint. They were forced inside the trailer, where Mary was crying uncontrollably at the table. Carl and Aubrey took a moment to observe her distress before forcing Chester to sit on the floor. Then Carl and Wayne took action. Wayne pushed Chester into the bedroom where Ned's lifeless body lay, and without hesitation, he shot Chester once with his gun. Carl, not done yet, turned his attention to Aubrey, who was 57. He led him into the same bedroom and shot him once. In a tragic final moment, when the bodies were found, it was clear that Aubrey's fingers were folded over Jerry's, his nephew. It was as if, in his last moments, Aubrey reached out to hold Jerry's hand, a heartbreaking symbol of love and loss before succumbing to his injuries. After the brutal killings, Mary Alday was dragged from the bathroom and taken back into the kitchen, where Carl didn't show any sign of mercy, assaulting her himself. Once he was finished, Wayne did the same. By now, the gang had decided it was time to leave, but they weren't done yet. They took Mary in her car, driving deep into the woods. But Carl wasn't done tormenting her. He yanked her out of the car by her hair and dragged her through the dirt. He assaulted her again, humiliating her in ways no one should ever have to endure. Then, in a chilling and twisted display, they took degrading photographs of her. After all this suffering, they decided it was time to end her life. George then forced Mary onto the ground, her face pressed into the earth. He shot her once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber gun. Once they finished, they abandoned her body in the car in the woods like it meant nothing at all. That's when Carl, Wayne, Billy, and George sped off. But the news of the murders spread fast, shaking the small community to its core. Donaldsonville was a quiet town where something like this was unheard of, and no one could wrap their heads around the senseless violence. But rather than splitting the community apart, the tragedy seemed to unite everyone even more. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers rallied together, offering their help to the remaining Alday family members. With the farm at risk and everything in turmoil, they stepped in, making sure the farm's operations continued. Then, just a few days later, the town came to a standstill. 3 days after the murders, Donaldsonville officially stopped everything for the day to mourn the Alday family. The mayor declared a day of mourning, and the streets were empty, as if the entire town had hit pause. On May 17, 1973, the funeral processions began, and nearly every single person from the town, and many from surrounding areas, gathered outside the Spring Creek Baptist Church. The church was way too small to hold 6 coffins and the huge crowd that showed up to mourn, so they ended up holding the funeral right outside on the church grounds. The Alday family was remembered for more than just their hard work and dedication to the community. They were the kind of neighbors everyone wanted, kind, helpful, and always there when needed. But while the town was grieving, the fugitives had already made their way to West Virginia, trying to put as much distance between them and the crime they'd committed. That's when fate finally caught up to them. They were found after being forced to flee on foot when they ran into a roadblock. This time, there was no escape. George was the first to crack. He confessed everything, spilling the details of the horrific jailbreak and how it led to the massacre of the Alday family. For 2 long hours, he recounted everything, expressing deep regret, especially for what he had done to Mary. He admitted that the weight of his actions had kept him up at night, and he couldn't live with himself anymore. With George's confession in hand, investigators wasted no time turning their attention to the others, starting with Billy. At first, it seemed like Billy wasn't as involved in the killings. He didn't allegedly shoot anyone, according to George. But ballistics told a different story. The Alday family had been killed with 4 different weapons, and one of those weapons was in Billy's possession. Billy's version of events was almost identical to George's. He said Carl had taken his gun when they were shooting Jerry because Billy had run out of bullets. Since the story seemed believable, and Billy was too young for the death penalty, investigators decided to flip him. In exchange for his testimony against the other 3, Billy was given to 40-year sentences for theft charges, and he was more than willing to take the deal. Then came Wayne, who was a whole different story. He had no remorse whatsoever. In fact, he sounded proud when he talked about what he had done. He even smiled as he described the killings, bragging about how he took the lives of the Aldays. Wayne wasn't backing down from his actions and made it clear he had no regrets. And then there was Carl. When investigators tried to get him to talk, he refused to say a word. Instead of confessing, he gave them the oddest response. It was a pretty May day. That was it. No remorse, no explanation, just an eerie nonchalance in the face of his crimes. But the evidence against Carl and his crew was undeniable. Their fingerprints matched those found at the crime scene, and the bullets they had in their possession were the same as those used to kill the Alday family. Additionally, they were found with several personal items from the Alday family, including jewelry, further linking them to the horrific massacre. The escapees were returned to Georgia on May 24, 1973, and arraigned at the courthouse in Donaldsonville. George, Carl, and Wayne faced 6 counts of murder and multiple felony charges, including assault, kidnapping, armed robbery, and grand theft. While the trio sat in separate jails miles apart, the community was furious. They demanded justice and even threatened to take matters into their own hands. But with the trials on the horizon, the town didn't need to resort to street justice. As if things weren't complicated enough, information about the missing teenager, Richard Miller from Pennsylvania, began to surface. An eyewitness came forward, claiming that Richard had been chasing a group of men matching the fugitives' descriptions. Law enforcement believed that if Carl and his crew were involved, Richard was likely dead. After some pressure, the men confessed to killing him, with Wayne Coleman volunteering to lead police to his body. However, things didn't go as planned. After being flown to Maryland, Wayne took police on a wild goose chase around the borders of Pennsylvania and Maryland, only to admit that he had no idea where Richard's body was. But then, in an unexpected twist, Carl offered his help. He was transported out of state, but this time he proved to be more cooperative. Carl led investigators to a small town in Maryland called Flintstone, where he gave precise directions to Richard Miller's remains. Carl's trial began on December 31, 1973. Several witnesses were called to the stand, including members of the Alday family who identified personal items that had belonged to their loved ones, found in Carl's possession. The sheriff and responding officers also testified. However, the most shocking witness was Billy, Carl's 16-year-old brother. Billy took the stand on January 4th, recounting the tragic final moments of the Alday family. His testimony lasted for 2 hours, and it left a lasting impact. After the case went to the jury, it didn't take long, just a little over an hour, for them to return with a verdict: guilty on all charges. Additionally, on January 7, 1974, the jury in Carl Isaacs' case recommended the death penalty, and the judge agreed. George's trial followed, starting on January 9, 1974, with a similarly swift process. The jury deliberated for just 58 minutes before finding him guilty on all charges and sentencing him to death. Wayne's trial lasted 3 days, but he too was found guilty and sentenced to death. Initially, the executions were set for February 15th that same year, but due to mandatory appeals, the executions were delayed.
If you had it to do all over again, do you really honestly think that it would have turned out differently if you had anything to do about it?
Well, it'll turn out different in some ways. As far as pulling that trigger and killing them people, I believe it would happen again.
This clip was from Carl Isaacs' interview on June 12, 1976, where he still showed absolutely no remorse for his actions. Over the years, the men filed several unsuccessful appeals. In 1979, a discovery motion led to retrials for all three in 1988. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled that the pretrial publicity had been so overwhelming that the defendants could not have received a fair trial and that a change of venue should have been granted. During the retrial process, Carl was first to face the courtroom again in January 1988 with an emotional testimony from his brother Billy, who recounted the tragic events. In 1988, Carl's taped confession, which had been recorded by filmmaker Fleming Fuller, was also used in the trial, with Carl seemingly incriminating himself. Despite character witnesses who claimed Carl had reformed, including a woman he had corresponded with and who believed he had changed, the jury once again sentenced him to death. Wayne's trial took place in April 1989, where his attorney claimed Wayne was manipulated by Carl. However, despite his defense, Wayne was sentenced to death, though after 35 hours of deliberation, the jury became deadlocked, and a mistrial was declared. Eventually, Wayne was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. George, however, was deemed mentally incompetent to be executed due to his low IQ, leading to him receiving 6 life sentences after pleading guilty by reason of mental deficiency in 1988. By this point, many people were outraged. Not only were the suspects still alive and living well in prison, but the Alday family had also faced serious financial hardship along with their emotional pain. The surviving members lost their farm and much of the family's wealth. Ernestine Alday, the last member of the family to survive, passed away in 1988, leaving behind a legacy of grief and financial ruin. But out of all the pain and tragedy, something positive did come from it, thanks to Paige Barber, the granddaughter of Ned Alday and the niece of several of the victims. As the voice of the Alday family, Paige fought hard for the passage of the Alday Family Bill in 2003. This law made it a requirement for state officials to contact the families of victims in death penalty cases twice a year. Before this bill, families had a tough time getting any updates on what was happening with their loved ones' cases in the legal system. Additionally, books and films were created to share the Alday family's heartbreaking story, like the 1988 film Murder One and the book Blood Echo by Thomas H. Cook. These works helped bring national attention to their tragic experience. As for the men involved, George Dungy died in 2006 while serving his life sentence. Billy Isaacs, who served 20 years, was released in 1993, but he passed away in 2009. Wayne, still alive, continues to serve his life sentence and is now 79 years old, repeatedly denied parole. Carl Isaacs met his end on May 16, 2003, with his execution marking the painful end to a long and drawn-out battle for justice. His final meal? A simple prison tray. After almost 30 years of delays, he was pronounced dead by lethal injection, closing a chapter on the Alday family's tragic story. But here's a question for you. Do you think true justice was ever served for the Alday family? Or do you feel the legal system failed them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.